Alrighty, Creativity 101. It is something I'm very excited about, topic that interests me to no end. All right, so what we're going to be talking about is what makes creative thinking different and how to get started. All right, so here we go. Let's say that we're in business together. And it's really important that we all know here I'm the handsome guy on the right. Okay. Let's say we're in business together and we're trying to solve a problem. I'm going to give you sort of the flip side of creativity first to give you an example. And we get together and I go up and I put down three obvious solutions to our problem, solution A, B, and C, and we chat about it and we decide solution A is too expensive. Solution B, we don't have the manpower for. So what we're left with is kind of the leftover. Maybe it doesn't have the firepower of solution A or B, but we can do it, all right? So we all sort of leave with this idea that it's kind of like, well, it's what we have. It's not the best solution, but I guess it's practical. Okay. This kind of thinking is called critical thinking. And we're trying to reduce the quantity of solutions down to a single one. And this is also called convergent thinking. You're trying to converge on the one idea that's going to work for us. And critical thinking is by its very nature reductive. Okay, you're trying to reduce the information, the quantity of solutions, that kind of stuff. Now, let's pretend that we decided we were not going to go with the three obvious solutions, that we had different tools in our tool bucket, and we put up the obvious solutions, solution A, B, and C, and we start to see immediately that there are some problems with those, but we have the ability to create new solutions, solutions D, E, F, G, ad infinitum. Creative thinking is by its nature generative, right? So it's all about generating new ideas, whereas convergent thinking or critical thinking is reductive in nature. Creative thinking is generative in nature. Trying to create new options. Also, it is called divergent thinking. You'll run across that term sometimes. Now, by themselves, creative thinking and critical thinking are limited in their usefulness. All right, what good is it if you've got 1,000 ideas if you can't get to a good practical idea? What good is critical thinking if you reduce your all of your solutions to kind of a meh solution, or you reduce your solutions to none? Then where are you? All right. These two things work together really well when it comes to problem solving. All right, you create a lot of ideas and then you reduce them to the practical, useful ones that you can use. All right, now, what is creativity? It depends on who you ask. All right, I've done a lot of reading on this topic, and the research, every research paper that I read basically spends a large amount of time trying to define what creativity is for the purposes of their research, because creativity does not have a single sort of definition. For the purpose of our class, we're going to be working down into a pretty comfortable definition of creativity, one that we can all use. And that is this. In its simplest form, creativity is about making connections, all right? Connections that you didn't see before, okay? And here's an example, all right? So we all familiar with a motorcycle, we're all familiar with jet airplanes, but what if you mix the two? That's what the producers of this device did. And this form of creativity, anyone can do. Seriously, anybody can do this. You just add two ideas together and you get something delicious, right? Not every time. but you see what I'm saying. All right, with this definition of creativity, anybody can work with it. It only requires two things. One is a domain, and the other is a person to create novelty, right? To create those connections between two things. No special brilliance is required. This has been studied. This is a really interesting topic in that they studied the relationship between IQ and creativity, and what they found is that there is very little relationship between a high IQ and high creativity. Uh, what they did discover is if you have a normal brain, that you can do creativity uh, of excellent quality. All right, does not require any special genius to do this. All right, so when I talk about a domain, what I'm talking about is an area of study. And the area of study will always include knowledge. You have to have a base knowledge. You don't have to have a high IQ, but what you do have to do is have a base knowledge upon which to work so you can begin to make those connections. All right, so a mathematician has to understand his multiplication tables before he's going to go off and create new theories. All right, a musician has to understand octaves to be able to create music. There is always a specific symbolic language involved with a domain, and I'll explain a little bit more about that in a moment. And there are the artifacts of any domain. So it's the physical resources of that domain. All right, every domain has a language, and what I mean by that is not English. Okay, so I'm not talking about English words, because those same English words will mean two different things in two different domains. Okay, so every language has specific symbolic language. Musical notation is a symbolic language. All right, so where you put your notes on the staff, math symbols, all right, those are specific language. But I want to speak specifically about jargon. And jargon isn't a bad thing. It's not a bad word. Some people think that jargon is always bad. Jargon simply means this. It is how we talk about certain subjects. If you're in the domain of music, if you're talking about domain of music, and you talk about rhythm, that means one thing to the musician. If you talk about rhythm, for instance, to a graphic designer, rhythm is a repeating visual pattern. All right, so even though it's the same word, it means two different things and two different concepts. So here's an example of a graphic design concept that we talk about all the time. It's called white space. White space is the space around a focal point. Okay, so here's my focal point, and the white space, even though it's not white, it's orange. The white space is all that space around the focal point. You wouldn't understand that unless you had been working in design for a little while. All right, so even though it's not white, it's called white space. So this is a subject-specific language, and you have to learn that. To be creative, you've got to learn the language. All right, how do we know something is creative? Well, it's pretty subjective, okay? Let's say we're working in genetic science, and I've got this idea to create a flying pig. Right? We're going to use basically two things to decide whether that thing is creative. First of all, is it a novel idea? Have we seen it before? Is it new? Does it have an element of surprise to it? The other thing is usefulness. How useful would it be to have a flying pig? All right. So for novelty, let's say I give it thumbs up. And for usefulness, I give it a thumbs down. Okay. Yeah, I see that is a really new idea, but I sure don't want to see flying pigs. I have no use for flying pigs. Can you imagine the manure? Holy cow. Mihai Csikszentmihalyi has been studying creativity. He's a psychologist. He's written several books. And he calls this form of creativity, where you're basically making connections between things that maybe haven't been seen before, are useful. He calls this small c creativity, right? It's sort of the everyday creativity. On the other hand, big C creativity is what moves the needle in culture. All right, it basically changes the world. And in order to sort of fall into that category, the requirements are a bit more stringent. So psychologists who study creativity looked at traits of highly creative people. And what they found is a lot of creative people have a lot of similar traits, but not all. But all creative, eminent creative people have two traits, and those are a burning curiosity for whatever it is they want to study for their domain, and they also have a tremendous focus. And the way they get that focus is basically push everything else aside, and in order to focus on what makes them curious. All right, so they get rid of distractions. That's one of the big things, is they get rid of distractions. They put a lot of time and energy into the thing that they're studying in order to innovate. Creativity is serious fun. All right, even the eminently creative will say, what I'm doing is work. It is work. It's a sweat labor. But on the other hand, they find that what they're doing is so enjoyable they couldn't see themselves doing anything else. All right, how do I get started? First of all, what makes you curious? Feed that curiosity. Maybe think back to a time where you spent a lot of time doing certain activities because you found them so interesting. Maybe you got pulled off of those because of other responsibilities. What was it that made you curious in the first place? Maybe start investigating those things. Secondly, you got to have a base of knowledge, all right? And you have to have a firm base of knowledge. It's got to be significant. For instance, in music, you've got to learn how to read the notation, or you have to understand how the notes are put together, or what makes for good music, what are the aesthetics, what is dissonance. Those kinds of things have to be in place before you can really begin to innovate with the rules of the domain, with the artifacts of the domain, and so forth. And lastly, you have to devote uninterrupted attention to it. Now, the great offender nowadays is the cell phone, right? How many times a day do you check your cell phone for, instant messages and other posts and that kind of stuff? Well, you've got to put that away. You've got to clear out what I call mind space. You've got to create a bubble for yourself in order to focus. And that requires time and energy. If you have to clean your desk to clear your mind space, then clean your desk. If you've got to find a quiet place because there's a lot of noise in your house, go find that quiet space. You've got to create a bubble so that you can give yourself uninterrupted attention. Now, regarding the use of your electronic devices, I have to put this caveat out there that in order to build your knowledge, you may need to do some reading. You may need to do some watching of videos on YouTube. That kind of stuff is perfectly fine. What I'm suggesting is that if you're not building your knowledge with that and it is distracting you, that device is distracting you, you got to put it away so that you can work undistractedly. All right, so I'm going to leave you with this thought. This was the final piece in Mihai's book, Creativity, about flow. And it's really about your happiness, right? Creativity, using your creativity will hopefully create for you a richer experience in life. And I hope that's what you get when you begin to really exercise your creativity.